What if the silence in your life isn't proof that God has forgotten you? Ethan Carter stared at another rejection email, wondering why every door kept closing after months of prayers. The harder he tried, the more distant hope seemed to feel. Then one sleepless night, he read about Abraham, a man who received a promise long before he saw any evidence. That's when a painful thought struck him. What if the waiting wasn't punishment, but preparation? As his faith reached its breaking point, Ethan discovered something hidden inside every promise of God. And what he learned changed far more than his circumstances. The full journey begins where hope almost ends. Have you ever wondered if the reason you're hurting so much is because you've been carrying hope for too long without seeing anything change? Maybe you know that feeling. You wake up each morning trying to stay strong, trying to believe that something good is still ahead, but deep inside, a quiet exhaustion keeps growing. You smile for others. You keep moving. Yet when you're alone, questions begin to whisper in the darkness. How many more disappointments can one heart carry before it starts letting go of hope? Ethan Carter knew that feeling well. One rainy evening, he sat alone staring at a rejection email that seemed almost identical to the many that had come before it. Months of effort, months of prayers, months of believing that the next opportunity might finally be the one. And once again, another door had closed. It wasn't just about work. It wasn't just about money. It was the painful feeling that life kept moving forward for everyone else while he remained stuck in the same place. Sometimes the deepest pain is not failure itself. It is the fear that nothing will ever be different. Ethan lowered his head and felt a heaviness he could barely explain. He had done everything he knew to do. He had worked hard. He had stayed patient. He had tried to keep his faith alive. Yet the silence felt overwhelming. And perhaps that is where many hearts find themselves today. Not angry, not rebellious, just tired. Tired of waiting. Tired of hoping. Tired of wondering whether their prayers are disappearing into an empty sky. But what if the most dangerous moment is not when life becomes difficult? What if it is the moment we begin believing that our story is already over, while God is still quietly writing the next chapter? The next morning looked no different from the day before, and somehow that was the hardest part. Ethan got out of bed, answered emails, searched for opportunities, and tried to keep moving forward. From the outside, he seemed responsible and resilient. But inside, a quiet battle was taking place. Every new rejection felt heavier than the last, because it was no longer just testing his plans. It was testing what he believed about himself. He began wondering if all his effort mattered at all. Have you ever reached a point where you stopped fearing failure and started fearing that nothing would ever change? That kind of struggle can slowly drain the strength from a person's soul. Ethan still prayed, but his prayers sounded different now. They were shorter, more tired, less certain. He wasn't losing his desire to believe. He was losing the energy to keep hoping. And perhaps that is a pain many people carry in silence. Not the absence of faith, but the exhaustion of carrying faith through a season that seems endless. Yet there was something noble about Ethan's struggle. Even in his weariness, he continued showing kindness to people around him. He continued helping when he could. He continued getting up each day. Sometimes we think strength looks like confidence, but often strength looks like simply refusing to become bitter. That is one of life's hidden truths. Suffering can either harden the heart or deepen it. As the days passed, Ethan felt caught between two voices. One whispered that his story was already decided, that disappointment was all he should expect. The other, quieter voice urged him not to give up yet. And somewhere between those voices stood the human heart, longing to trust, struggling to understand, and desperately searching for a reason to keep believing that tomorrow could be different from today. One night, unable to sleep, Ethan sat alone in the dim light of his living room. The silence felt familiar now, almost like an unwelcome companion that had followed him for months. His mind replayed every disappointment, every unanswered prayer, every moment he had wondered whether his efforts were leading anywhere at all. He reached for an old Bible resting on a nearby shelf, not because he expected a miracle, but because he didn't know where else to turn. Sometimes the first step toward healing is not finding an answer. It is simply refusing to stop searching. As he slowly turned the pages, his eyes settled on the story of Abraham. Ethan had heard the story before, but that night something felt different. He read about a man who received a promise long before he saw any evidence that it would come true. Years passed. Circumstances seemed impossible, yet the promise remained. Ethan paused and stared at the page. A question quietly entered his heart. What if God's promises were never meant to be measured by today's circumstances? For the first time in a long while, he considered the possibility that waiting did not automatically mean abandonment. The thought did not erase his struggles. The bills were still there. The uncertainty was still real. But something inside him shifted ever so slightly. Life often teaches us that if something takes too long, it must not be meant for us. Yet some of the most valuable things in life require patience before they reveal their purpose. Ethan wasn't suddenly filled with confidence. He wasn't certain everything would work out, but he felt a small spark where only exhaustion had existed before. It was fragile, almost easy to miss. Still, it was there. And sometimes a single spark of hope is enough to remind a weary heart that darkness is not the same thing as the end of the story. For a few days, that small spark of hope stayed with Ethan. He returned to the story of Abraham more than once, holding on to the possibility that waiting might have a purpose he could not yet see. But hope can be difficult to protect when reality keeps knocking at the door. The challenges in his life did not suddenly become easier. If anything, they felt heavier because now he was carrying two burdens at once: the weight of his circumstances and the effort required to keep believing. Sometimes the hardest part of faith is not starting to believe. It is continuing to believe after nothing changes. Ethan began noticing a deeper struggle unfolding within him. It was no longer just about opportunities, finances, or unanswered prayers. He found himself questioning who he was beneath all the disappointment. Had he placed too much of his worth in success? Had he quietly believed that being faithful should guarantee a smoother path? The questions were uncomfortable because they reached places he usually avoided. One of life's strangest paradoxes is that adversity often reveals truths about us that comfort never could. As the days passed, Ethan felt caught between expectation and reality. He wanted to trust God's promises, yet he could not ignore what he saw with his own eyes. The gap between what he hoped for and what he experienced seemed wider than ever. And isn't that where many people find themselves? Standing between a promise and a problem, wondering which one tells the truth about their future. The human heart longs for certainty, but growth often happens in uncertainty. That realization did not bring immediate peace. Instead, it exposed another fear. What if he kept hoping and was disappointed again? Yet another quiet insight emerged from the struggle. Protecting yourself from disappointment may also protect you from hope. Ethan sat with that thought for a long time. Deep inside, he sensed that the real battle was no longer taking place around him. It was taking place within him, in the fragile space where faith and fear were learning to coexist. There comes a moment in many lives when the struggle is no longer about solving a problem. It is about finding the strength to keep carrying it. Ethan reached that moment quietly. There was no dramatic event, no single piece of bad news. Instead, it felt like standing in a room where the lights had been slowly dimming for so long that he barely noticed how dark it had become. The hope he had rediscovered felt distant now, hidden behind layers of fatigue and unanswered questions. He still remembered the promises he had read about, but they seemed difficult to connect with the reality he was living. Have you ever felt that painful tension between what you believe and what you feel? Ethan knew it well. His mind told him to trust, but his heart was tired of waiting. Some nights he sat in silence, unable to find words for prayer, not because he had stopped caring, but because he no longer knew what to say. The deepest spiritual exhaustion is not always anger toward God. Sometimes it is simply feeling too weary to reach for him. A troubling thought began visiting him more often. What if nothing was changing because nothing was ever going to change? He hated the question, yet he could not completely silence it. And perhaps many people know that feeling. The fear of becoming invisible, forgotten in a world that keeps moving forward. Yet even in that darkness, Ethan noticed something surprising. Despite all his doubts, he had not completely walked away. Somewhere beneath the confusion, a tiny part of him still wanted to believe. Life holds a strange paradox. The very fact that we continue wrestling with faith may be evidence that faith is still alive. A heart that truly no longer cares stops asking questions. Ethan was still asking, still searching, still longing for meaning. The road ahead remained unclear, but far beyond the fog of disappointment, there was still the faintest glimmer of light. waiting where he could not yet see. One afternoon, while reflecting on the story of Joseph, Ethan found himself lingering on a detail he had overlooked for years. Joseph received a dream filled with promise, yet much of his life afterward seemed to move in the opposite direction. Betrayal, loss, false accusations, years of waiting, none of it looked like progress. Ethan had always focused on the ending of the story. This time, he found himself thinking about the long middle, the years no one would have chosen, the years that made no sense while they were being lived. And suddenly, a quiet realization began to emerge. What if the seasons we call delays are not empty spaces in our story? What if they are chapters doing important work that we cannot yet see? Ethan thought about his own life. For months, he had measured every day by visible results. If nothing improved, he assumed nothing meaningful was happening. But perhaps that assumption was incomplete. Perhaps growth often happens beneath the surface long before it becomes visible above it. Just as roots deepen before a tree rises, something inside a person may be strengthening long before circumstances begin to change. This thought did not remove his uncertainty, but it softened something within him. One of life's hidden truths is that we often ask why a door remains closed while overlooking who we are becoming as we stand in front of it. Ethan began to wonder whether the greatest work happening in his life was not around him, but within him. He noticed that he had become more compassionate toward others who struggled, more patient with pain, more aware of how fragile and precious hope can be. These were not the victories he had been seeking, yet they were real. And perhaps that is another paradox of life. Sometimes we discover our deepest blessings disguised as seasons we once wished away. For the first time in a long while, Ethan stopped asking only when things would change and started asking what this season might be teaching him. As the weeks passed, Ethan found himself looking at his journey differently. Not because all his questions had been answered, but because he was beginning to understand that a single moment rarely reveals the meaning of an entire story. There had been times in his life when something painful happened and he could not understand it, only to look back years later and see how that very experience had shaped him in ways he never expected. Perhaps life was filled with meanings that could only be recognized in hindsight. Perhaps some chapters are understood only after they have ended. This thought brought an unexpected sense of peace. Human beings naturally judge a journey from the place where they currently stand. If the road is difficult, we assume the destination must be disappointing. If the season is confusing, we assume the future must be uncertain. Yet how often have we discovered that what felt like a detour was actually preparation? One of life's quiet paradoxes is that we often want clarity before we move forward, while wisdom is usually gained by moving forward without complete clarity. Ethan thought again about Abraham, Joseph, and countless others whose stories seemed incomplete in the middle. None of them could see the full picture while they were living it. They only saw the next step. And perhaps that is true for all of us. We are not given the entire map at once. We are invited to trust the path one step at a time. A gentle realization settled into Ethan's heart. Maybe the value of his journey was not determined by how quickly it reached a happy ending. Maybe it was determined by what it was producing along the way. Compassion, patience, humility, resilience. These qualities rarely grow during easy seasons. They are often born in places we would never choose. For the first time in many months, Ethan felt less pressure to understand everything. He did not need every answer today. It was enough to believe that a story could hold purpose long before its meaning became visible, and that unseen purpose was still quietly unfolding. The circumstances of Ethan's life had not changed very much. The same uncertainties remained. The same unanswered questions still appeared from time to time. Yet something remarkable was happening beneath the surface. The struggle that had once consumed all of his attention no longer defined his identity. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to see himself differently. For so long, he had measured his worth by outcomes, opportunities, and visible progress. Now he was beginning to understand that a person's value does not rise and fall with success or failure. It comes from something deeper, something that cannot be taken away by disappointment. This realization brought a kind of freedom he had never expected. One afternoon, Ethan noticed himself responding differently to a friend's hardship. Instead of comparing struggles or offering quick solutions, he simply listened. He understood pain in a way he had not before. Sometimes the wounds we wish had never happened become the very places where compassion is born. That thought stayed with him. Perhaps growth is not becoming stronger than everyone else. Perhaps it is becoming gentler with the burdens that everyone carries. As his perspective shifted, Ethan also found himself letting go of certain resentments. He stopped blaming himself for every closed door. He stopped replaying old failures as if they were final verdicts on his future. The strange thing about forgiveness is that it often begins long before we feel completely healed. It begins when we decide that yesterday will no longer be allowed to control tomorrow. Little by little, peace started replacing the constant pressure he had carried for months. Not because he suddenly knew what would happen next, but because he no longer felt responsible for carrying the entire future on his shoulders. One of life's most beautiful paradoxes is that courage is not always moving forward without fear. Sometimes courage is learning to rest while uncertainty remains. And as Ethan looked ahead, he realized that although his circumstances were still unfolding, his heart was no longer trapped where it had once been. He was becoming someone stronger, kinder, and more at peace than the person who had first entered the storm. Sometimes hope returns so quietly that we almost miss it. It does not always arrive as a miracle or a dramatic breakthrough. Sometimes it appears as a small reminder that our story is still moving forward. One morning, Ethan received a phone call about an opportunity he had never expected. It was not the perfect answer to all his problems. It was not the dream he had imagined months earlier. Yet as he listened, he felt something awaken inside him that had been dormant for a long time. Possibility. For the first time in many months, the future no longer felt like a closed door. It felt like a path he could not fully see but was willing to walk. What if hope is not the certainty that everything will work out exactly as planned? What if hope is simply the courage to believe that new possibilities can still exist beyond our current view? Ethan found himself smiling in a way he had not for a long time. Not because all his questions had disappeared, but because he realized he no longer needed every answer before taking the next step. As the day unfolded, he noticed other things as well. The kindness of a friend, the beauty of a quiet sunrise, the simple gift of another day to begin again. Strange how pain can narrow our vision until we see only what is missing, while healing slowly teaches us to notice what remains. Gratitude began growing in places where frustration had once lived. Ethan understood that the opportunity before him might succeed, or it might lead to another unexpected turn. Yet somehow that uncertainty no longer frightened him the way it once had. One of life's most beautiful revelations is that peace does not come from controlling the future. It comes from trusting that we can face whatever the future brings. As he looked ahead, Ethan felt a quiet sense of thankfulness. The circumstances around him were still unfolding, but his heart was no longer trapped in survival mode. And perhaps that was the unexpected hope he had been searching for all along. There was a time when Ethan believed the purpose of faith was to lead him quickly toward the life he wanted. Looking back now, he realized how much that belief had shaped his expectations. He thought peace would come after the breakthrough. Confidence would come after success. Gratitude would come after everything finally made sense. But the journey had taught him something very different. The things he was waiting for on the other side of the mountain had quietly begun growing within him while he was still climbing it. That realization changed everything. How many of us spend years chasing a future version of ourselves, believing we can only be at peace once certain problems disappear? Yet life often reveals a surprising truth. The qualities we seek are rarely found at the end of the journey. They are formed during the journey itself. Ethan thought about the months he had spent feeling lost, disappointed, and uncertain. If someone had offered to erase all those difficult days, he once would have accepted without hesitation. Now he was not so sure. Those seasons had taught him empathy for people carrying invisible burdens. They had taught him patience with his own imperfections. They had taught him that human worth is not measured by achievement, but by the capacity to love, endure, and remain kind when life becomes difficult. One of the deepest forms of wisdom is realizing that pain is not always an enemy. Sometimes it becomes a teacher we never invited but desperately needed. This did not mean suffering was good or that hardship should be celebrated. It meant that even difficult chapters can carry gifts hidden beneath the surface. Ethan's greatest revelation was not that every promise arrives exactly as expected. It was that no season is wasted when it helps us become more compassionate, more courageous, and more fully ourselves. And perhaps that is a truth for every heart listening today. The person you are becoming may be more important than the circumstances you are trying to change. There was no single moment when Ethan realized he was healing. It happened the way dawn arrives, slowly, gently, almost unnoticed at first. One day he found himself thinking about the disappointments that had once consumed him, and they no longer carried the same weight. The memories were still there, but they no longer felt like chains. Somewhere along the journey, he had stopped fighting the past and started making peace with it. Perhaps one of the kindest things we can do for ourselves is to stop demanding that yesterday be different. Ethan had spent so much energy replaying old conversations, old mistakes, old hopes that never unfolded the way he expected. He had blamed himself for things he could not control and carried burdens that were never meant to rest entirely on his shoulders. But now a different understanding was taking root. What if healing begins when we stop asking why everything happened the way it did and start asking how we can move forward with grace? That question softened something deep within him. He began extending compassion to himself in ways he had freely given to others, but rarely offered inward. He no longer saw his struggles as evidence of weakness. He saw them as proof that he had kept going through difficult seasons. And isn't that true for so many people? We often judge ourselves by our scars while admiring others for surviving theirs. One of life's gentlest revelations is that we deserve the same kindness we so readily give away. Ethan also found himself releasing quiet resentments, not because the pain was imaginary, but because carrying it had become heavier than letting it go. Forgiveness, he discovered, is not pretending that wounds never existed. It is choosing not to let them define the rest of your story. As that truth settled into his heart, a deep calm followed. The future remained uncertain, but uncertainty no longer felt threatening. For the first time in a very long while, Ethan felt at home within himself, and in that peaceful place, hope could finally breathe again. As Ethan reflected on everything he had been through, he realized that the most meaningful lessons were not reserved for extraordinary moments. They belonged to ordinary days, the kind of days every person experiences. The days when a family member disappoints us, when work feels uncertain, when relationships become complicated, or when we quietly wonder whether we are doing enough with our lives. The journey had taught him that growth rarely happens in perfect conditions. More often, it happens in the middle of unfinished situations. Perhaps that is comforting, because it means we do not have to wait for life to become perfect before we begin becoming stronger. In his relationships, Ethan learned the value of patience. He had spent so much time wishing people would understand his struggles that he began paying closer attention to the struggles others carried as well. Everyone is fighting battles that are not immediately visible. When we remember that truth, kindness becomes easier. In his work, he learned that progress is not always measured by immediate results. Sometimes showing up consistently, learning from setbacks, and remaining faithful to our values is a victory in itself. One of life's most important lessons is that success can build confidence, but perseverance builds character. And character stays with us long after circumstances change. Ethan also discovered something valuable about his relationship with himself. He no longer viewed every mistake as evidence that he was failing. Instead, he saw mistakes as part of being human. Growth is not about becoming flawless. It is about becoming wiser, more compassionate, and more honest with ourselves. How much lighter would our hearts be if we spoke to ourselves with the same understanding we offer a good friend? As he looked ahead, Ethan understood that life would still bring challenges. Yet he no longer saw challenges as proof that something was wrong. They were simply part of the journey shared by every human being. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: we do not need to have everything figured out to keep moving forward with hope, grace, and an open heart. The morning arrived quietly, much like every other morning before it. The sun rose without fanfare. The world continued its familiar rhythm. Yet something was different. Ethan stood by the window and felt a calm he could not have imagined during the darkest days of his journey. The problems in his life had not vanished overnight. There were still unanswered questions ahead, still roads he had yet to walk. But for the first time, he no longer believed that uncertainty was something to fear. He had learned that peace is not the absence of questions. Peace is learning that your heart can remain steady even while questions remain. As he reflected on everything he had experienced, Ethan realized that the greatest gift of the journey was not the opportunity that had appeared or the doors that might open in the future. It was the person he had become along the way, more compassionate, more patient, more understanding of both his own struggles and the struggles of others. Sometimes we begin a difficult season asking for a different life, only to discover that life is gently shaping a different version of us. And often, that transformation becomes the answer we never knew we needed. If you have walked through disappointment, if you have carried silent worries, if you have spent nights wondering whether your hopes still matter, perhaps there is something important to remember. The chapters that feel unfinished today are not necessarily failures. They may simply be chapters that are still being written. The story is not over because the path is unclear. The path is simply continuing beyond what you can currently see. Ethan smiled softly as the morning light filled the room. He no longer needed to rush toward the future or cling to the past. It was enough to take the next step with gratitude, courage, and an open heart. And maybe that gentle truth is meant for you as well. You have carried so much for so long. Rest for a moment. Breathe deeply. Be kind to yourself. The road ahead may still hold surprises, but so does hope. And your journey, beautiful and unfinished, is still moving toward the light.